The sound of her sobbing carried across the prairie like a wounded animal's cry, and Jake Thornton reined in his horse so fast the gelding nearly sat back on its haunches. It was late afternoon in the summer of 1878, and the Montana Territory stretched out in every direction under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Jake had been riding fence line for the better part of the day, checking for breaks and making mental notes of repairs that would need doing before winter came howling down from Canada. He was tired, dusty, and looking forward to a hot meal and his bunk back at the ranch. But that sound stopped him cold. A woman was crying somewhere nearby, and out here in the middle of nowhere, that meant trouble. He urged his horse forward, following the sound over a small rise, and that was when he saw her. She was kneeling in the tall grass near a dried creek bed, her shoulders shaking with the force of her tears. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in waves down her back, and her simple calico dress was dusty and torn at the hem. Even from a distance, Jake could see the desperation in the way she held herself. "Ma'am," he called out, not wanting to startle her. "Are you hurt?" She looked up quickly, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, bright even through the tears, and Jake felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her. She was young, probably around his own age of 24, and pretty in a way that had nothing to do with fancy clothes or careful grooming. There was something real about her, something that spoke of hard work and determination. "It's my calf," she said, her voice breaking. "My little heifer calf. She got through the fence somehow, and now she's gone. I've been looking for hours, and I can't find her anywhere." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "She's all I have. My father left her to me before he died last winter, and if I lose her, I lose everything. She was going to be the start of my own herd. Without her, I'll have to sell the land and move back east to live with my aunt." Jake dismounted and walked closer, his boots making soft sounds in the dry grass. "How long has she been missing?" "Since this morning," the woman said, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "I noticed she was gone when I went to feed at dawn. I've been searching ever since, but the prairie is so big, and she's just a little thing. She could be anywhere. A wolf could have gotten her, or she could have fallen in a ravine, or gotten stuck in mud somewhere." Her voice rose with each possibility, panic threading through her words. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Thornton," he said, crouching down so he was at eye level with her. "I work for the Bar T Ranch about 5 miles west of here, and I'm going to help you find that calf." She looked at him with those green eyes, hope and doubt warring in her expression. "You don't have to do that. I'm sure you have your own work to do." "Nothing that can't wait," Jake said firmly. "Now, what's your name, and can you describe the calf for me?" "Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Mitchell. And the calf is a red heifer, about 3 months old. She has a white star on her forehead and white socks on her back feet. She's small for her age because her mother died when she was just a few weeks old, and I've been bottle feeding her." Jake nodded, already thinking about where a young calf might wander. "You said she got through the fence. Show me where." Sarah stood up, brushing at her skirt, and led him across the grassland to a small homestead that sat in a shallow valley. It was a modest place, just a one-room cabin with a lean-to barn and a small corral. The fence around the property was in decent shape, but Jake could see where one section had been damaged, probably by an animal rubbing against it, or maybe by the spring winds that blew through these parts with enough force to lift a man off his feet. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a gap in the lower rail. "I found it like this when I came out to feed her. She must have squeezed through during the night." Jake examined the gap, then stood and looked out at the surrounding landscape. The sun was already starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. He had maybe 4 hours of good daylight left, possibly less. "Which direction have you already searched?" "North and east," Sarah said. "I went as far as I could on foot, but I don't have a horse anymore. We had to sell him last month to pay for seed." "All right then, we'll start south and west." Jake went back to his horse and swung up into the saddle. He reached down and offered his hand to Sarah. "Come on, we'll cover more ground with you riding with me." Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then took his hand. Jake pulled her up behind him, and she settled onto the horse's back, her arms coming around his waist to hold on. He tried not to think about how that felt, the warmth of her against his back, the trust she was placing in a stranger. There would be time to think about that later. Right now, they had a calf to find. They rode slowly, with Jake scanning the ground for tracks, while Sarah kept her eyes on the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. The prairie was deceptive in its emptiness. It looked flat and bare from a distance, but up close it was full of hidden coulees and draws where a small animal could easily disappear. There were also plenty of dangers out here for a young calf on its own. Wolves, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion that came down from the high country, looking for easy prey. "Tell me about your father," Jake said, after they had been riding for a while. He wanted to keep Sarah talking, to keep her from spiraling back into panic. There was a long pause, and then Sarah spoke, her voice soft against the evening air. "He was a good man, strong and kind. He came out here 5 years ago, after my mother died of consumption back in Ohio. He thought the fresh air and the open space would be good for us, that we could build something here. And we did for a while. The cabin, the fences, the well. He worked so hard." She paused, and Jake could hear the pain in her voice. "But last winter was brutal. The cold came early and stayed late. He caught pneumonia in December and was gone by January. I buried him on the hillside overlooking the valley." "I'm sorry," Jake said, and he meant it. He knew what it was like to lose family. His own parents had died when he was 16, killed in a Sioux raid on their homestead in the Dakota Territory. He had drifted west after that, working ranches and learning the trade, until he had landed at the Bar T 3 years ago. "The calf was born just a few weeks before he died," Sarah continued. "He was so proud of her. He said she was going to be the foundation of something great, that by the time I was old enough to marry and have children of my own, we would have a whole herd and a real ranch. He made me promise to take care of her, to not give up no matter how hard things got." "And you've kept that promise," Jake said. "You're still here, still fighting. That takes courage." "It doesn't feel like courage," Sarah admitted. "Most days it just feels like stubbornness. But I can't give up. Not on the land, not on the calf, not on the dream my father had for us." They rode in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the whisper of wind through the grass. The sun continued its descent, and the shadows grew longer. Jake felt a knot of worry forming in his gut. They were running out of daylight, and without the calf, Sarah would lose everything. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. They came to a wide draw that cut through the prairie like a scar, and Jake guided the horse down into it. The bottom was sandy and dotted with scrubby brush and a few stunted cottonwoods that marked where water sometimes flowed during the spring runoff. He dismounted and studied the ground, looking for any sign that the calf had come this way. "There," Sarah said suddenly, sliding down from the horse and hurrying forward. "Look, is that a track?" Jake knelt down and examined the mark in the sand. It was small and cloven, exactly the right size for a young calf. "That's her," he said, feeling a surge of hope. "She came through here, and not too long ago either. This track is still fresh." They followed the trail through the draw, moving quickly now. The tracks led them deeper into the cut, where the walls rose higher on either side and the shadows grew thick. Jake kept one hand on his rifle, just in case. This would be a perfect place for a predator to corner a young calf. They rounded a bend, and there, caught in a tangle of brush and old deadfall, was the calf. She was bawling pitifully, her red coat matted with burrs and dirt. She had managed to get herself wedged between 2 fallen logs, and the more she struggled, the tighter she became trapped. "Oh, thank God," Sarah breathed, rushing forward. "Easy, baby, easy now. We're here to help you." The calf thrashed harder at their approach, her eyes rolling white with fear. Jake moved carefully, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Steady there, little one. Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to get you out of this mess." He assessed the situation quickly. The logs were old and weathered, but they were heavy, pinning the calf at an awkward angle. If they tried to just pull her out, they might injure her. They would need to lift one of the logs first to create enough space. "Sarah, you keep her calm while I move this log," Jake said. "Talk to her. Let her know you're here." Sarah nodded and knelt down, reaching through the tangle to stroke the calf's head. "It's all right, sweetheart. It's me. You're going to be just fine." The calf seemed to recognize her voice and stopped thrashing quite so violently, though she continued to make distressed noises. Jake gripped the log and heaved. It was heavier than it looked, waterlogged from some ancient flood, but he put his back into it, and slowly, inch by inch, it began to move. His muscles burned with the effort, and sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. Finally, with one last grunt of effort, he shifted the log far enough to create a gap. "Now!" he gasped. "Pull her through now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the calf under its front legs and pulled, and the little animal came free in a rush, nearly bowling Sarah over in its panic. But Sarah held on, wrapping her arms around the calf and murmuring soothing words until the animal finally calmed down enough to stand on shaky legs. "Let me check her over," Jake said, running his hands carefully over the calf's body, checking for injuries. There were some scrapes and bruises, and she was clearly exhausted and dehydrated, but nothing seemed to be broken. "She's going to be all right. She just needs food and water and rest." Sarah's face crumpled with relief, and fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. But these were different from the desperate tears he had seen earlier. These were tears of joy and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "You would have found her eventually," Jake said, but Sarah shook her head. "No, it was getting dark, and I was losing hope. You saved her. You saved everything." Jake felt heat rise in his face at the intensity of her gaze, at the gratitude shining in those green eyes. He cleared his throat and looked away. "We should get her back to your place. She needs care, and it's going to be dark soon." The calf was too weak to walk the whole way back, so Jake fashioned a makeshift sling from his rope and lifted the animal across his saddle. It was awkward and uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it worked. Sarah walked alongside, one hand on the calf's back, providing comfort and reassurance. Jake led the horse, and they made their slow way back across the prairie as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the stars began to come out overhead. By the time they reached Sarah's homestead, it was full dark. Jake helped Sarah get the calf into the small barn and settled on a pile of clean straw. Sarah immediately set about tending to the animal, cleaning her wounds and offering water, which the calf drank greedily. Jake found himself watching Sarah work, admiring the gentle competence of her hands, the way she spoke softly to the calf, as if it could understand every word. "She's going to need food," Sarah said, looking up at him. "I have milk in the cabin. I'll warm it up for her." "I'll get a fire going," Jake offered. He went outside to the small fire pit near the cabin and got a good blaze started, then waited while Sarah went inside. She emerged a few minutes later with a bucket of milk and a pan, which she set on a metal grate over the flames. They stood together in the firelight, watching the milk warm, and Jake was acutely aware of how close she was standing, how the light caught in her hair and made it shine like silk. "I can't thank you enough," Sarah said quietly. "You spent your whole evening helping me, a complete stranger. Most men would have just ridden on by." "I'm not most men," Jake said, and then immediately felt foolish for saying something that sounded like it came straight out of a dime novel. But Sarah smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face and made Jake's heart skip a beat. "No," she agreed, "you're not." She tested the milk with her finger, then poured it into a bottle fitted with a rubber nipple. They went back into the barn, and Sarah knelt down next to the calf, offering the bottle. The little animal latched on immediately and began to suck with desperate enthusiasm, her tail twitching with pleasure. Jake found himself smiling as he watched. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing the calf recover, about knowing that he had helped make this moment possible. And there was something more, something he was trying not to examine too closely. He barely knew Sarah Mitchell, had met her only hours ago, but already he felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just that she was pretty, though she was. It was something deeper, something about her strength and determination, the way she had refused to give up even when things seemed hopeless. When the calf had finished the bottle and settled down to sleep, Sarah stood up and brushed the straw from her skirt. "You must be starving. Please come inside. Let me make you some supper. It's the least I can do." Jake knew he should decline, should head back to the ranch where his boss would be wondering where he had gotten to, but he found himself nodding instead. "That would be nice. Thank you." The cabin was small but tidy, with a single room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all at once. There was a narrow bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves lined with dishes and supplies. It was sparse, but everything was clean and well-maintained. Sarah lit a lamp and set about making supper, and Jake sat at the table and watched her work. "I hope you like beans and cornbread," Sarah said apologetically. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." "Sounds perfect," Jake said honestly. He had eaten worse plenty of times, and besides, he was more interested in the company than the food. As Sarah cooked, they talked. Jake told her about his work at the Bar-T Ranch, about the cattle drives he had been on, and the country he had seen. Sarah told him about her life before Montana, about growing up in Ohio and the journey west with her father. She spoke about the challenges of running the homestead alone, about the neighbors who had tried to buy her land for pennies on the dollar after her father died, assuming she would give up and leave. "But I won't leave," Sarah said fiercely, setting a plate of food in front of Jake. "This is my home. My father is buried here. His dreams are here, and I'm going to make them come true no matter what it takes." Jake looked at her across the table, at the determination in her eyes and the set of her jaw, and he felt something warm and solid settle in his chest. "I believe you will," he said. They ate together in comfortable silence, and when the meal was done, Jake knew he really did need to head back to the ranch. He stood up reluctantly and reached for his hat. "I should get going. My boss will have my hide if I don't show up for morning chores." "Of course," Sarah said, standing as well. She walked him to the door, and they stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Thank you again, Jake, for everything. You gave me back hope when I thought I had lost it." "You never lost it," Jake said softly. "It was there all along. You just needed a little help, that's all." On impulse, he reached out and took her hand. It was small and work-roughened in his, but it felt right there. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide in the lamplight, and Jake felt the world narrow down to just the two of them, standing in the doorway of a tiny cabin under a sky full of stars. "Can I come back?" he asked. "Tomorrow, maybe, to check on the calf?" "I'd like that," Sarah said, and her smile was like the sun coming up over the prairie. "I'd like that very much." Jake rode back to the Bar-T Ranch with a grin on his face that he couldn't seem to shake, even when his boss, old Tom Brennan, gave him a hard time about missing supper and being late to the bunkhouse. Nothing could dampen his mood, not even the ribbing he got from the other ranch hands when they saw the expression on his face. He had met someone special tonight, someone worth riding through the dark for, and he couldn't wait to see her again. True to his word, Jake showed up at Sarah's homestead the next day right after he had finished his morning chores. He brought supplies with him, things he had bought with his own money at the general store in town. Sugar and flour, coffee and bacon, and a bag of grain for the calf. Sarah's face lit up when she saw him riding up the path, and she came out to meet him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jake, I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I said I would," Jake replied, swinging down from his saddle. "How's the patient doing?" They went into the barn together, and Jake was pleased to see that the calf was already looking much better. She was standing on steady legs, and she came over to nuzzle at Sarah's hand, looking for treats. The scrapes on her hide were already starting to heal, and her eyes were bright and alert. "She's a tough little thing," Sarah said proudly, "just like her mother was." Jake helped Sarah with her morning chores, mending the gap in the fence where the calf had escaped and reinforcing some of the other weak spots. They worked side by side in the warm morning sun, and Jake found himself enjoying every moment of it. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside Sarah, about seeing the immediate results of their labor, about knowing that he was helping her hold on to her dream. When the work was done, Sarah invited him in for coffee, and they sat at her little table and talked about everything and nothing. Jake told her stories about life on the ranch, about the characters he worked with and the adventures he had had. Sarah laughed at his tales, and the sound of her laughter was like music to his ears. "You have a gift for storytelling," she said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "I just have good material," Jake replied with a grin. "You should meet Cookie, our camp cook. That man has forgotten more cuss words than most people ever learn, but he can make a stew out of just about anything, and his biscuits are lighter than air." "I'd like to meet him someday," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone, some hint of possibility, that made Jake's heart beat faster. He started coming by every day after that. Sometimes he came in the morning before heading out to work. Sometimes he came in the evening after his shift was done. He always brought something with him. Tools to help with repairs, food to supplement Sarah's meager supplies, or just his company and his willingness to help with whatever needed doing. Slowly, steadily, the homestead began to look better. The fences were solid, the barn roof was patched, and the garden Sarah was trying to grow started to flourish under their combined attention. And slowly, steadily, something grew between them as well. It started with shared smiles and lingering glances. It progressed to hands that touched and held on just a little longer than necessary. They talked about their pasts and their hopes for the future. They shared meals and laughter and quiet moments watching the sun set over the prairie. And through it all, the attraction between them built like a summer storm gathering on the horizon, powerful and undeniable. One evening, about 3 weeks after they had first met, Jake arrived to find Sarah in the barn, brushing down the calf, which had grown noticeably larger and stronger in the intervening weeks. She looked up when he entered, and the smile that crossed her face made his breath catch. "I was hoping you'd come tonight," she said softly. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Jake replied, and he meant it. He crossed the barn and stood close to her, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her skin. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Jake said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know we haven't known each other long, and maybe it's crazy, but I can't stop thinking about you. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I fall asleep. I love your strength and your determination. I love the way you care for that calf, like it's your own child. I love the sound of your laugh and the way your eyes light up when you smile. I just love you, Sarah, and I needed you to know that." For a long moment, Sarah just stared at him, her eyes wide and shining in the dim light of the barn. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, and it was like watching the dawn break over the mountains. "Oh, Jake," she breathed, "I'm falling in love with you too. I have been almost from the moment I first saw you. You came into my life when I had lost all hope, and you gave me back everything I thought was gone. You've shown me kindness and patience and care, and you've never asked for anything in return. I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes." Jake reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "Don't be scared," he murmured. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." And then he kissed her, soft and sweet at first, then deeper as Sarah's arms came up around his neck and she pulled him closer. It was a kiss full of promise and possibility, a kiss that spoke of lonely nights ending and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Jake rested his forehead against Sarah's, just holding her close and marveling at the miracle of finding this woman, this love, out here in the middle of nowhere. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. "I know it's fast, but I don't care. I want to spend my life with you, Sarah. I want to help you build your dream, to grow that herd and make this place into something amazing. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. Marry me." Sarah pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, and Jake could see joy and love shining there, bright as the stars overhead. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, Jake, I'll marry you. Nothing would make me happier." They stood there in the barn, holding each other and laughing with pure happiness, while the calf watched them with curious brown eyes and the prairie wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect, and Jake knew he would remember it for the rest of his life. The next morning, Jake went to see his boss, Tom Brennan, at the ranch. Tom was a gruff older man with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes, but he had a good heart, and he had always treated Jake fair. Jake found him in the main house, going over the books. "Boss, I need to talk to you," Jake said, hat in hand. Tom looked up from his ledgers and studied Jake's face. A slow smile spread across his features. "This about that little gal you've been mooning over for the past few weeks?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "How did you know about that?" "Son, I've been running this ranch for 30 years. Not much happens around here that I don't know about. Besides, you've been whistling while you work and grinning like a fool. Wasn't hard to put two and two together." Tom leaned back in his chair. "So, what about her?" "I asked her to marry me last night, and she said yes," Jake said, unable to keep the pride and happiness out of his voice. "I want to do right by her, boss. She's got a homestead about 5 miles east of here, and she's trying to build it into a working ranch. I was hoping I could keep working here while I help her get the place going. Maybe take on some extra work, earn a bit more money to put towards supplies and stock." Tom was quiet for a long moment, and Jake felt a knot of worry form in his stomach. If Tom said no, he would still marry Sarah, but it would make things a lot harder. They needed the steady income from his ranch work. Then Tom surprised him by standing up and extending his hand. "Congratulations, son. I'm happy for you, and I'll do you one better than extra work. You've been a good hand these past 3 years, one of the best I've had. How about I sell you a few head of cattle at a fair price, and you can start building that herd your gal wants? You can pay me back over time, with your labor or with money, whatever works out best." Jake gripped Tom's hand, almost speechless with gratitude. "Boss, I don't know what to say. That's more than generous. You're a good man, Jake Thornton, and you deserve a chance at happiness. Besides, I like the idea of having a friendly neighbor to the east. Means we can help each other out when times get tough. And out here, times are always tough eventually." Tom grinned. "Now get out of here and go tell your bride to be the good news. And don't worry about your shift today. Consider it a wedding present." Jake left the ranch feeling like he was walking on air. He rode straight to Sarah's place and swept her up in his arms the moment she came out to meet him, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. "Jake, what's gotten into you?" Sarah gasped, her hands clutching his shoulders. "Tom is selling us cattle," Jake said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her waist. 5 head to start with, at a price we can actually afford. We can do this, Sarah. We can really build something here." Sarah's eyes went wide, and then she was kissing him, hard and fierce, pouring all her joy and relief and love into that kiss. When they broke apart, both of them were grinning like children on Christmas morning. "We need to get married soon," Sarah said breathlessly. "I don't want to wait, do you?" "Not even a little bit," Jake agreed. "How about next week? We can go into town, find the preacher, and make it official. It doesn't need to be fancy." "Next week sounds perfect," Sarah said. "I don't need fancy. I just need you." They spent the rest of the day making plans, talking about the future they would build together. They would combine Jake's experience and steady income with Sarah's land and determination. They would grow the herd slowly but surely, adding a cow here and a calf there as they could afford it. They would fix up the cabin, maybe add a room or two as their family grew. It would be hard work, and there would be setbacks and challenges, but they would face them together. The week passed in a blur of activity. Jake gave notice at the bar T, though Tom convinced him to stay on part-time to help with roundup and branding when they happened. Sarah cleaned the cabin from top to bottom and made herself a new dress from fabric she had been saving, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Jake bought a new shirt and had his good pants cleaned and pressed. They made arrangements with the preacher in town, a friendly man named Reverend Caldwell, who was delighted to perform the ceremony. On the morning of the wedding, Jake woke up early in the bunkhouse, too excited to sleep. He washed and dressed with care, slicking back his dark hair and examining himself critically in the small mirror that hung on the wall. He was no dandy, that was for sure. His face was tanned and weathered from years of working outdoors, and his hands were calloused and scarred. But his eyes were honest, and his heart was true, and he hoped that would be enough for Sarah. The other ranch hands clapped him on the back and offered their congratulations as he saddled up his horse. Cookie even packed him a basket of food for the wedding celebration, including a small cake that he had baked special for the occasion. "You treat that gal right, you hear?" Cookie said gruffly, his eyes suspiciously bright. "She's getting a good man, but you're getting a treasure. Don't you forget it." "I won't," Jake promised. "I'll spend every day for the rest of my life making sure she knows how much she means to me." He rode to Sarah's place and found her waiting outside, and his breath caught at the sight of her. She was beautiful in her new blue dress, her dark hair pinned up and adorned with a few wildflowers she had picked from the prairie. She was glowing with happiness, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart ache with love. "You look amazing," Jake said, dismounting and taking her hands in his. So do you," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "I can hardly believe this is real. A month ago, I was alone and losing hope. Now I'm about to marry the man I love. It feels like a dream." "It's real," Jake assured her, bringing her hands to his lips and kissing them gently. "And it's just the beginning." They rode into town together, Sarah sitting in front of Jake on his horse, nestled safely in his arms. The town was small, just a handful of buildings clustered around a main street, but it had everything they needed: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a small church where Reverend Caldwell was waiting for them. The ceremony was simple and brief, with only the Reverend and his wife present as witnesses, but it was heartfelt and meaningful, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed his bride with a tenderness and passion that made Mrs. Caldwell sigh happily. After the ceremony, they stopped at the general store to pick up a few supplies and to let the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, know that Sarah was now Mrs. Thornton. Mr. Henderson was a kindly older man who had known Sarah's father, and he insisted on giving them a bag of penny candy as a wedding present. "Your father would be so proud of you, Sarah," Mr. Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always said you were the strongest person he knew, and he was right. You've held on when others would have given up, and now you've found yourself a good man to stand beside you. I know you two are going to do great things." Sarah hugged the old man, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. That means more to me than you know." They rode back to the homestead as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Jake had never seen anything more beautiful, except maybe for the woman riding beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his. When they reached the cabin, Jake insisted on carrying Sarah over the threshold, and she laughed and clung to him as he swept her into his arms and carried her inside. He set her down gently in the middle of the small room, and they stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, marveling at the fact that they were married, that they belonged to each other now. "I love you, Mrs. Thornton," Jake said softly. "I love you too, Mr. Thornton," Sarah replied, and then she was in his arms again, and they were kissing with all the pent-up passion and longing of the past few weeks. Jake lifted her up and carried her to the narrow bed in the corner, and they came together with a tenderness and urgency that left them both breathless and clinging to each other in the darkness. Later, as they lay tangled together under a thin quilt, Sarah rested her head on Jake's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered. "After my father died, I thought my life was over. But then you came along and changed everything." Jake stroked her hair gently, marveling at the softness of it. "You changed my life, too," he said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from one ranch to another, never really putting down roots. But now I have a home, a wife, a future. You gave me all of that." "We gave it to each other," Sarah corrected, tilting her head up to look at him. "We're a team now, remember? Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," Jake agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. The next few months were a whirlwind of hard work and happiness. Jake moved his few belongings into the cabin, and he and Sarah fell into an easy rhythm of shared labor and shared life. They woke before dawn every morning and worked until the sun set, repairing fences, tending the garden, caring for the calf and the 5 cattle that Tom had sold them. It was back-breaking work, but it was good work, and they did it side by side, always finding time to share a smile or a kiss or a word of encouragement. The calf, which Sarah had named Rosie, grew strong and healthy. She followed Sarah around the homestead like a puppy, and she had a particular fondness for stealing vegetables from the garden, which always made Jake laugh. The 5 cattle they had bought from Tom settled in well, and by the end of summer they had their first calf born on the property, a sturdy little bull that Jake declared was the finest animal he had ever seen. "You say that about every calf that's born," Sarah teased, watching as Jake examined the newborn with obvious pride. "That's because they're all the finest," Jake replied with a grin. "Just wait. In a few years, we're going to have the best herd in the territory." As fall approached, Jake helped Tom with the roundup at the bar tea, earning extra money that they put toward to buying more supplies for the winter. Sarah spent her days canning vegetables from the garden, smoking meat, and preparing the homestead for the cold months ahead. She had seen how brutal winter could be in Montana, and she was determined that they would be ready this time. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Sarah reached for Jake's hand and placed it on her belly. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you." Jake looked at her, seeing the mixture of joy and nervousness in her eyes. "What is it?" "I'm going to have a baby," Sarah said softly. "We're going to have a baby, sometime in early spring, I think." For a moment, Jake just stared at her, the words not quite sinking in. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a fool. "A baby? We're going to have a baby?" Sarah nodded, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Yes. Are you happy about it?" "Happy?" Jake laughed and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she squeaked in protest. "Sarah, I'm over the moon. I'm ecstatic. I'm the happiest man in the entire world." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "We're going to be parents. We're going to have a family." "I was hoping you'd be pleased," Sarah said, laughing through her tears. "I know we're still just getting started here, and money is tight, but But nothing, Jake interrupted firmly. This is the best news I've ever gotten. We'll make it work. We'll do whatever we need to do to take care of you and the baby. You're not alone in this, Sarah. You have me, and I'm going to make sure you and our child have everything you need. That winter was hard, but they faced it together just as they had promised. The snow came early and piled high, and the temperatures dropped so low that the water in the bucket froze solid overnight. But the cabin was snug and warm, the pantry was well stocked, and the cattle were sheltered in the barn. Jake spent his days chopping wood, tending the animals, and making sure Sarah had everything she needed. Sarah grew rounder as the weeks passed, and Jake marveled at the changes in her body, at the miracle growing inside her. They talked for hours about their hopes and dreams for their child, about what kind of parents they wanted to be. They chose names, arguing good-naturedly about the merits of traditional names versus more unusual ones. They made plans for expanding the cabin, for adding a separate bedroom where the baby could sleep. It was a time of nesting and preparation, of quiet joy and anticipation. In early March, as the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the longer days and the slight warming of the air, Sarah went into labor. It started in the early morning, with pains that were mild at first, but steadily grew stronger. Jake, trying not to panic, rode hell for leather to the neighboring homestead 5 miles away, where a woman named Mrs. Patterson lived. She was known throughout the area as a skilled midwife, and Jake had made arrangements with her months ago to be on call when Sarah's time came. Mrs. Patterson was a stout, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, and she took one look at Jake's white face and patted his arm reassuringly. "First baby jitters," she diagnosed with a knowing smile. "Don't you worry, young man. I've delivered more babies than I can count, and your wife is young and strong. She'll do just fine." They rode back to the homestead together, and Mrs. Patterson took charge the moment they walked through the door. She sent Jake to boil water and fetch clean linens, and she stayed by Sarah's side throughout the long hours of labor, offering encouragement and expertise in equal measure. It was late afternoon when their son was born, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to anyone within earshot. Jake, who had been pacing a trench in the floor outside the cabin, rushed in the moment Mrs. Patterson called for him. He found Sarah propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son," Sarah said softly, her voice tired but filled with love. Jake approached the bed on shaky legs, hardly daring to breathe. Sarah pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny red face, a shock of dark hair, and the tiniest fingers Jake had ever seen. The baby's eyes were closed, and he was making small snuffling sounds that went straight to Jake's heart. "He's perfect," Jake breathed, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers immediately closed around his thumb, and Jake felt something inside him shift and settle, like a key turning in a lock. "He's absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, looking up at Jake with shining eyes. Jake thought about all the names they had discussed over the long winter months, but suddenly none of them seemed right. Then he remembered the man who had given Sarah and her father a chance when they came to Montana, who had helped them get started on this land. "What about John?" he suggested. "After your father?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. John Thornton. I think my father would have loved that." Mrs. Patterson stayed with them for a few days, making sure both Sarah and the baby were healthy, and teaching Jake how to help care for his new son. She was pleased with how well they were both doing, and when she finally left, she did so with instructions to send for her if they needed anything at all. Those first weeks with baby John were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Jake learned how to change diapers and how to walk the floor at 2 a.m. when the baby wouldn't sleep. He learned how to support Sarah as she learned to nurse, and how to take over some of her usual chores so she could rest and recover. And he learned what it meant to love someone so small and helpless, with a fierceness that actually hurt sometimes. Spring turned to summer, and life settled into a new rhythm. John grew and thrived, becoming a chubby, happy baby who smiled easily and rarely fussed. The herd continued to grow as well, with 2 more calves born that season. The garden flourished under Sarah's care, and Jake built a larger corral and made improvements to the barn. Money was still tight, but they were making progress, building toward the future they had dreamed of. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while John slept in Sarah's arms, Jake looked around at everything they had built and felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked quietly. Sarah smiled, her eyes distant with memory. How could I forget? I was crying over a lost calf, certain that my whole world was coming to an end. And then you rode up like something out of a storybook and saved the day. You saved yourself, Jake corrected. You never gave up, even when things looked hopeless. I just helped a little. You did more than help a little, Sarah said, reaching over to take his hand. You gave me back my hope and my dreams. You gave me love and a family. You gave me everything that matters. Jake squeezed her hand, his heart full to bursting. We gave each other everything. That's what makes it so special. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from gold to orange to deep purple. The prairie stretched out before them in all directions, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. The cattle were settled for the night. The garden was bursting with vegetables, and their son was healthy and happy. It wasn't an easy life, and there would be challenges ahead, but they had each other, and that was enough. 2 years passed, and the Thornton homestead continued to prosper. The herd grew to 15 head, then 20. Jake and Tom Brennan developed a partnership where Jake helped with roundups and drives in exchange for access to Tom's bull for breeding. Sarah's garden expanded, and she started selling her excess produce at the general store in town, earning a little extra money that they put toward buying more land and more cattle. John grew from a baby into a toddler, learning to walk and talk and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of the very young. He adored the animals, especially Rosie, who was now a full-grown cow and still remarkably gentle and patient, with the little boy who liked to try to ride her like a horse. Jake built John a small rocking horse and taught him songs about cowboys and cattle drives, and Sarah read to him from the few precious books they owned. In the spring of 1881, Sarah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Emma after Sarah's mother. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the moment she was born, she had her whole family wrapped around her tiny fingers. John was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, from changing her diapers to singing her to sleep. We're building something real here, Jake said one night as they lay in bed, listening to the soft breathing of their children sleeping in the small bedroom they had added to the cabin. Your father would be so proud of you, Sarah. We have a real ranch now, not just a homestead. We have a herd, land, and a family. We've done what we set out to do. We're not done yet, Sarah replied with a smile in her voice. There's still so much more we want to accomplish. But you're right, we've come so far. Sometimes I can hardly believe how much our lives have changed since that day you found me crying over a lost calf. Best day of my life, Jake said, pulling her close. The day I found you. The day we found each other, Sarah corrected, and Jake had to agree. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. There were good years when the rains came at the right time and the cattle thrived, and there were hard years when drought or disease tested their resilience. There were blizzards that buried the homestead in snow and summer storms that threatened to flatten the crops. But through it all, Jake and Sarah faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing season. John grew into a capable young boy who could ride a horse almost before he could walk properly. He followed his father everywhere, learning the skills he would need to run the ranch someday. Emma was quieter than her brother, but just as determined, and she had a gift for gentling even the most skittish animals. In 1884, Sarah gave birth to twin boys, Thomas and William, who kept the household in chaos with their boundless energy and mischievous schemes. The Thornton Ranch, as it was now known, expanded to over 200 acres, with a herd of nearly 50 head of cattle. They built a proper house to replace the original cabin, a sturdy 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a parlor where Sarah could display the few nice things they had accumulated over the years. The old cabin became a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands Jake had hired to help with the work. Jake and Sarah's love story became something of a legend in the area. People talked about how Jake had searched through the night to find Sarah's lost calf, how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that had built an empire. Young couples would sometimes ride out to the ranch just to see the place and to hear the story from Jake and Sarah themselves. "Tell us again how you met," Emma would beg on winter evenings when the family gathered around the fire. "Tell us about Rosie and how Papa saved her." And Jake would tell the story, never tiring of it, about the day he heard a woman crying and stopped to help, about following tracks through the prairie and pulling a frightened calf from a tangle of deadwood, about riding back through the darkness with Sarah on his horse and falling in love over a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Sarah would add her own details, about how she had been at her lowest point when Jake appeared, about how he had given her back her hope and her dreams. The children would listen with rapt attention every time, even though they had heard the story dozens of times before. It never got old, this tale of how their parents had met and fallen in love, how a lost calf had brought them together and started them on the path to building the life they now lived. Rosie lived to a grand old age for a cow, finally passing away peacefully in the spring of 1892. She had mothered over a dozen calves in her lifetime, and her descendants made up a good portion of the Thornton herd. Jake and Sarah buried her on the hillside overlooking the valley, not far from where Sarah's father was laid to rest. It seemed fitting, somehow, to honor the animal that had brought them together, that had been there at the beginning of their love story. As the years turned into decades, Jake and Sarah grew older, but not less in love. Their hair turned gray and their faces became lined with age, but their eyes still lit up when they looked at each other, and they still found reasons to laugh together every day. Their children grew up and started families of their own, but they all stayed in the area, building their own homesteads or working on the family ranch. The Thornton name became synonymous with hard work, integrity, and enduring love. In the summer of 1900, Jake and Sarah celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary with a big party at the ranch. All 4 of their children were there, along with their spouses and a growing horde of grandchildren. Tom Brennan came, now retired from running the bar T, but still spry and sharp-witted. Mrs. Patterson was there, now in her 70s, but still delivering babies when called upon. Half the county seemed to turn out for the celebration, and there was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. As the sun began to set and the party showed no signs of slowing down, Jake took Sarah's hand and led her away from the crowd, out to the old corral where they had spent so many evenings watching the stars come out. It was quieter here, away from the noise and celebration, and they could hear the sounds of the prairie, the wind in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirping of crickets. 22 years, Sarah said softly, leaning against Jake's shoulder. Sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday that you rode up and found me crying, and sometimes it feels like we've been together forever. Both, Jake said, wrapping his arm around her waist. It's both. Every day with you feels new and exciting, but you're also so much a part of me that I can't remember what life was like before you. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked, looking up at him. We've worked so hard, and there have been so many difficult times. Do you ever wish you had chosen an easier path? Jake turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Sarah, I have never regretted a single moment. Not one. Yes, it's been hard work, and yes, there have been challenges. But we've built something amazing here. We have a thriving ranch, 4 incredible children, and more grandchildren than I can count. We have friends and neighbors who respect us and a legacy that will last long after we're gone. But more than that, I've had 22 years of waking up next to the woman I love, of building a life with my best friend and partner. How could I ever regret that? Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. I love you, Jake Thornton. I loved you when you were a young cowboy who stopped to help a desperate woman, and I love you even more now as the man who has stood beside me through everything life has thrown at us. I love you too, Sarah, Jake said, and he kissed her with all the tenderness and passion of a man who had loved the same woman for more than 2 decades and would love her for all the years yet to come. They stood there together as the last light faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear, one by one, like diamonds scattered across black velvet. From the house came the sounds of laughter and music, the voices of their children and grandchildren celebrating life and love and family. It was everything they had ever dreamed of and more, a future built on the foundation of one cowboy's kindness and one woman's determination to never give up. The years continued their steady march forward. Jake and Sarah celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th. Their grandchildren grew, and some of them had children of their own, making Jake and Sarah great-grandparents. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of John, who had inherited his parents' work ethic and his mother's head for business. Emma married a school teacher and moved to town, where she opened a store that sold goods shipped in from back east. The twins, Thomas and William, went into ranching together, buying land adjacent to the family property and expanding the Thornton holdings even further. Through it all, Jake and Sarah remained the heart of the family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They slowed down as the years took their toll, no longer able to work from dawn to dusk the way they once had. But they still rose early every morning and spent time together, walking around the property, checking on the cattle, tending the garden that Sarah still insisted on maintaining, even though her children begged her to let them do the heavy work. "I'm old, not dead," Sarah would say with a laugh when anyone tried to get her to rest more. "Besides, working in the garden keeps my hands busy and my mind sharp. I'll rest when I'm in the grave, and not a moment before." Jake felt the same way. As long as he could still ride a horse and fix a fence, he would keep doing it. The ranch wasn't just a business to him. It was his life's work, the physical manifestation of the dreams he and Sarah had built together. Every fence post he had planted, every calf he had helped deliver, every building he had constructed carried a piece of his heart. He couldn't imagine a life where he wasn't actively involved in the day-to-day operations of the ranch. In the spring of 1905, on a morning that dawned clear and bright, Sarah woke early and nudged Jake awake. "Come on," she said, her eyes sparkling with an energy he hadn't seen in a while. "I want to go for a ride." Jake looked at her in surprise. They didn't ride much anymore, finding it easier to walk or take the wagon when they needed to get somewhere. "A ride? Sarah, are you sure? Your joints have been bothering you." "My joints always bother me," Sarah said dismissively. "But today is a good day, and I want to go riding with my husband. Is that too much to ask?" Jake smiled and swung his legs out of bed. "Not at all. Where do you want to go?" "I want to see the place where we met," Sarah said. "Where you found me crying over Rosie. I haven't been out there in years, and I want to see it again." They saddled up two of the gentler horses and rode out across the prairie, moving slowly and savoring the morning. The sun was warm on their backs, and the grass was green from recent rains. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in splashes of yellow and purple and white, and birds sang from the fence posts as they passed. When they reached the spot where they had first met, Sarah dismounted and stood there for a long moment, just looking around. The dried creek bed was still there, though it had water in it now from the spring runoff. The corral and the cabin were long gone, replaced by newer, sturdier structures. But the land itself was unchanged, still the same rolling prairie that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. "I stood right here," Sarah said softly, pointing to a spot in the grass. "I was crying so hard I could barely see, certain that I had lost everything. And then I heard your voice calling out, asking if I was hurt. I looked up, and there you were, sitting on your horse like some kind of hero from a storybook." Jake dismounted and came to stand beside her, taking her hand in his. "And I looked down and saw the most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes on, with green eyes full of tears and a strength that shone through even in her darkest moment. I knew right then that you were special, that you were going to be important in my life. I just didn't know how important. You changed my entire world that day," Sarah said, turning to look at him. "You gave me everything, a family, a home, a love that has sustained me through every joy and every sorrow. I can never thank you enough for stopping that day, for caring enough about a stranger to help her find a lost calf." "You don't need to thank me," Jake said gently. "You gave me just as much, maybe more. You gave me a purpose, a reason to put down roots and build something lasting. You gave me children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You gave me a life worth living and a love worth fighting for. We saved each other, Sarah. That's what makes our story so special." They stood there for a long time, holding hands and remembering, two people who had loved each other through more than a quarter-century of life in the Wild West. The prairie stretched out around them in all directions, timeless and beautiful, a witness to their journey from strangers to lovers to partners in building a legacy that would outlast them both. As they rode back to the ranch, Sarah was quieter than usual, and Jake noticed that she seemed tired. He helped her dismount when they reached the barn, and he was alarmed to see how pale she looked. "Sarah, are you all right?" "Just tired," Sarah assured him, but her smile was strained. "That was more riding than I've done in a while. I think I'll go lie down for a bit." Jake helped her into the house and got her settled on their bed. He brought her water and made sure she was comfortable, and then he sat beside her, holding her hand and trying not to let his worry show. Sarah had always been so strong, so vital, that it was easy to forget she was in her early 50s now, and that the hard life they had lived had taken its toll on her body. Sarah seemed to fall asleep almost immediately, and Jake sat there watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest, and taking comfort in the steady rhythm. She would be fine, he told himself. She just needed rest. They had years ahead of them yet, more grandchildren to spoil, and more anniversaries to celebrate. They weren't done with their story, not by a long shot, but even as he tried to reassure himself, a cold knot of fear settled in his stomach, a premonition he couldn't quite shake. Sarah did rally over the next few days, regaining some of her energy and color, but Jake noticed that she tired more easily now, that she needed to rest more often. He tried to get her to see the doctor in town, but Sarah waved him off. "I'm fine, Jake. I'm just getting older, that's all. It happens to everyone." "You're not everyone," Jake said stubbornly. "You're my wife, and I want to make sure you're healthy." To please him, Sarah finally agreed to see the doctor during their next trip to town. Dr. Hoffman examined her thoroughly, and then sat them down in his office with a serious expression on his weathered face. "Mrs. Thornton, your heart is not as strong as it should be. The years of hard work and the stress of frontier life have taken their toll. You need to take it easier, get more rest, and avoid overexerting yourself." Sarah listened to his advice and nodded politely, but Jake could see the rebellion in her eyes. Taking it easy was not in Sarah's nature. She was a woman who had fought for every inch of ground she had gained in life, and she wasn't about to start sitting idle now. Still, she tried for Jake's sake. She let their daughters-in-law take over more of the household duties. She spent her days reading, sewing, and playing with the grandchildren who were always underfoot. But Jake could see that it chafed at her, this forced idleness. Sarah was a woman who defined herself by her work, by what she could accomplish with her own two hands. One evening in early fall, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah reached over and took Jake's hand. "Promise me something," she said quietly. "Anything," Jake replied, though his heart clenched with sudden fear. "Promise me that when I'm gone, you won't give up. You'll keep living, keep enjoying the family we built together. Don't just exist, Jake. Live." "Don't talk like that," Jake said roughly. "You're going to be fine. We're going to grow old together, just like we planned." "We have grown old together," Sarah said with a gentle smile. "We've had 27 wonderful years, Jake. We've built a family and a legacy that will last for generations. Not everyone gets that. We've been blessed." Jake wanted to argue, wanted to insist that 27 years wasn't enough, that he needed 50 more years at least. But looking at Sarah's face in the fading light, seeing the peace and contentment there, he found he couldn't speak. Instead, he just held her hand tighter and tried to memorize every detail of this moment, the warmth of her skin against his, the sound of her breathing, the way the last rays of sunlight caught in her hair. Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, on a cool October morning when the leaves on the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn gold. Jake woke to find her lying still beside him, her face peaceful and untroubled, as if she had simply drifted off and chosen not to wake up. The pain that tore through him in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced, worse than any physical injury he had ever sustained. He held her and wept, and his cries brought the rest of the household running. The funeral was held on the hillside overlooking the valley in the small family cemetery where Sarah's father and Rosie were already buried. It seemed that the entire county turned out to pay their respects to the woman who had become a legend in her own right. People spoke of her kindness and her strength, of the way she had built a ranch from nothing and raised a family that exemplified the best values of the frontier. They spoke of her love for Jake and how their story had inspired so many others to believe in the possibility of finding true love, even in the harsh reality of the Wild West. Jake stood at the graveside and listened to the words being spoken, but they seemed to come from very far away. He was numb, hollow, unable to fully comprehend a world that didn't have Sarah in it. How was he supposed to go on without her? She had been his partner, his best friend, his reason for getting up every morning for more than half his life. Without her, he felt lost and adrift, like a ship without a rudder. In the days and weeks that followed, Jake found himself going through the motions of living without really being present. He got up each morning because that was what he had always done. He went about his work on the ranch because it was familiar and comforting, but the joy had gone out of everything. Food tasted like ash in his mouth. The beauty of the prairie that he had always loved now seemed empty and meaningless. His children worried about him, and they took turns coming to stay at the ranch, making sure he was eating and taking care of himself. but Jake could see the concern in their eyes, could hear them whispering when they thought he couldn't hear. They were afraid he was going to give up, that he would simply fade away without Sarah to anchor him to life. It was John who finally broke through the fog of grief that surrounded Jake. He came to the ranch one morning, about a month after Sarah's death, and found his father sitting in the parlor, staring at nothing. "Pa," John said, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from Jake, "I need to talk to you." Jake looked at his son, seeing the worry and love in his face, and felt a stirring of something that might have been shame. "What is it, son?" "It's about Ma," John said bluntly. "About what she would want for you now." Jake flinched. "I don't want to talk about your mother." "I know you don't, but we're going to anyway, because Ma would have my hide if she knew I was letting you waste away like this." John leaned forward, his expression intense. "Ma loved you more than anything in this world, Pa. You know that. And she loved this ranch and this family. Do you really think she would want you to just give up, to stop living?" "I'm not giving up," Jake said defensively. "I'm still here, aren't I?" "You're here, but you're not living. You're just existing, going through the motions. That's not what Ma wanted for you. She made you promise to keep living. Remember? She told me about that conversation." Jake felt tears sting his eyes. "I don't know how to live without her, John. She was everything to me." "I know, Pa, and she always will be. But you have so much more than just memories. You have 4 children who love you. You have grandchildren and great-grandchildren who need to know their grandfather. You have a ranch that needs your expertise and your guidance. You have a story, Pa, a love story, that people will be telling for generations. Don't let that story end like this, with you sitting in a dark room waiting to die. Honor Ma's memory by living the life she would want you to live." Jake looked at his son through blurry eyes, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something other than pain. He felt a stirring of purpose, a reason to keep going. John was right. Sarah had made him promise to keep living, and he owed it to her to keep that promise. "She was so proud of you," Jake said finally. "All of you. The family we built, the legacy we created. She used to say that even if we lost everything tomorrow, we would still be rich beyond measure because we had all of you. Then honor that pride, Pa. Keep going. Keep being the man she fell in love with all those years ago when she was crying over a lost calf, and you stopped to help her." Jake nodded slowly, feeling strength begin to seep back into his bones. All right, I'll try." And he did try. It was hard at first, forcing himself to engage with life again, to find joy in the simple things that had always pleased him. But gradually, day by day, it got a little easier. He spent time with his grandchildren, teaching them the skills he had learned over a lifetime of ranching. He helped John make decisions about the ranch, offering advice and sharing stories from the early years. He went to town and caught up with old friends, men and women, who had known him and Sarah for decades and who shared their own memories of the remarkable woman he had loved. And every evening, he would walk up to the hillside cemetery and sit by Sarah's grave, telling her about his day and the things that had happened. He told her about the new great-grandchild that had been born, and how John had successfully negotiated a contract to sell their beef to the Army fort down south. He told her about the garden, which Emma was now tending, and how the roses Sarah had planted so many years ago were thriving. He told her that he missed her every moment of every day, but that he was trying to live the way she had wanted him to. The years passed, and Jake aged but never stopped working. He celebrated his 65th birthday surrounded by family, and then his 70th. He watched his grandchildren grow up and start families of their own. The Thornton Ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in the Montana Territory. And through it all, Jake carried Sarah with him, not just in his memories, but in everything he did. She was in the solid construction of the buildings they had built together, in the bloodlines of the cattle they had so carefully cultivated, in the values they had instilled in their children. In the spring of 1912, at the age of 78, Jake passed away peacefully in his sleep, just as Sarah had. He was buried beside her on the hillside, and the entire county once again turned out to pay their respects. The preacher who conducted the service spoke of Jake's life as a model of integrity, hard work, and enduring love. He spoke of the legend of how Jake and Sarah had met, of the cowboy who had searched through the night to find a lost calf, and had found love instead. Their children stood at the graveside and wept, but they also smiled through their tears because they knew their parents were together again. After 7 years apart, Jake and Sarah were reunited, their love story complete. The Thornton Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding their own chapter to the legacy that had been started by a desperate woman and a kind cowboy on a summer afternoon in 1878. The story of how they met became family lore, told and retold until it took on almost mythical qualities. But at its heart, it was a simple story. A story of kindness and determination, of love found in unexpected places, of two people who had built something lasting out of hard work and devotion. The house they had built still stood, expanded and modernized, but still recognizably the same structure. The hillside cemetery overlooked the valley, and fresh flowers were placed on Jake and Sarah's graves every spring by descendants who had never met them, but who knew their story by heart. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the prairie, people said you could sometimes hear echoes of laughter, the sound of a man and woman who had loved each other through all the joys and sorrows that life could bring. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West when the frontier was still raw and untamed. A story of a cowboy who found a woman crying over a lost calf, who searched until dawn and brought it back safe, and who, in doing so, found the love of his life. It was a story of building a life together from nothing, of facing challenges hand in hand, of creating a legacy that would outlast them both. And it all started with one simple act of kindness, one moment when a man chose to stop and help a stranger in need. That single decision changed two lives forever, creating a love story that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. Jake and Sarah Thornton had lived there happily ever after, not in some fairy tale castle, but in the harsh reality of the Montana Territory, proving that true love could flourish anywhere, even in the Wild West, as long as two people were willing to work for it and fight for it and never, ever give up on each other. Their story ended not with sadness, but with the satisfaction of a life well lived and a love well cherished. They had built something beautiful together, something that would endure long after they were gone. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy anyone could hope for. To be remembered not just for what you accomplished, but for how deeply and truly you loved.